This is the multiple award-winning GardenDC podcast, the podcast about everything gardening in the Mid-Atlantic region and beyond. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine. Our content is aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything, from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. Welcome to episode 272 of the GardenDC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Sam Hoadley, Manager of Horticultural Research at Mount Cuba Center, all about Goldenrod, Solidago species, for the Mid-Atlantic. The plant profile is on skunk cabbage, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in the What's New segment. We close out with the last word on the sweetest winter squash from Chrissy Page of Green Prints. This episode, we're joined by Sam Hoadley, Manager of Horticultural Research at Mount Cuba Center, who's returning to the podcast to talk all about the new report that Mount Cuba has put out on goldenrods, aka Solidago. Welcome back, Sam.
Thank you so much for having me back, Kathy. I really appreciate it.
Great to have you on. So it's been almost exactly a year since we had you on last, talking all about ironweeds. So what's been going on with you and with Mount Cuba? Any new developments or news you want to share?
Oh yeah, well, besides the Goldenrod report, which has been, front and center for the past couple of weeks, and it's been really what we've been working on for the past several months, things are always changing in the trial garden, which makes it really a lot of fun to work there. You're constantly learning about new plants. But some of the biggest new things that have been happening is we just started data collection on the Pycnanthemum trial, or mountain mints. That's been an unbelievable evaluation. I mean, they're beautiful garden plants, of course, but seeing the amount of pollinator and wildlife activity that's visiting all of those plants in that trial has been incredible. It's right up there with goldenrods in terms of the number and diversity of insects that we're seeing. It's truly impressive. And in addition to that, we just recently planted a new evaluation. We haven't started data collection yet. This was the first year to get that trial established, so we'll start collecting data this coming spring. But we just planted a new trial on blue stems. So this is Schizocariums, Andropogons, cultivated material, some examples of species that aren't very commonly grown. A really big trial that actually replaced the goldenrod trials in the same footprint. And we have about 70 different blue stems in that place as well, or in that location. And we'll start collecting data next year, which is really exciting to promote another group of plants that I think is partially known, similar to goldenrod. Some of them are really well known, but some of them really, I think, deserve a little bit more attention in the horticultural world.
And blue stem, you said Schizocarum. I think I've been saying Schizocarum for all these years.
Yeah, I think it's all good. I think I've heard lots of different pronunciations, and I think they're all equally valid.
Yeah, that is one of the harder botanical Latin terms, yes, I will say.
Yes, it is. Hard to pronounce and spell. Yes.
Exciting to hear that that's going to be next up in the trials and coming out in a couple years. So will the Mountain Mint one be the 2027 report, or is something else in between?
Yeah, so the Mountain Mints will be a couple more years, but next year around this time, we will most likely have written our milkweed report, the Asclepius report, which was a cool little trial. It's about 25 different milkweeds. We're looking at garden adaptability, but really focusing on monarch activity. And we have some really interesting data to share from that evaluation as well.
I know that one's going to be hotly wanted.
Yes, for sure. Yeah.
People are going to be grabbing that report as soon as it's on the newsstands, so to speak.
Absolutely.
If there were still some newsstands to grab it off of.
That's right. The virtual newsstands, for sure.
Yes. So I know people will be waiting for that really intensely. And then this one that we're going to talk about for this episode, Goldenrods for Gardens and Beyond. The first thing, of course, that jumps into a lot of gardeners' minds when you say goldenrod or solidago is ugh. I have to say that. Because it can be an aggressive spreader in the home garden. Some of them, especially the Canadian one, and the reseeding is well known. But I think in your trials, you've demonstrated some of the great qualities and why you would want to add goldenrod to your garden.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of nuance there, too, that we learned through this trial that yes, there are some of those plants that are a little more aggressive, and that's a very valid concern for certain species like Solidago canadensis and Altissima, Leavenworthii. But it doesn't mean that they don't belong in any landscapes. And there certainly are situations where you want plants with a more competitive edge, maybe in more naturalistic plantings or restoration plantings. But, in your small home garden where you're worried about maybe smaller, more delicate plants getting overwhelmed, maybe those aren't the best companions to be planting there. But if you're looking for a plant that's going to produce a lot of biomass and pollen and nectar and just attract a huge amount of wildlife to your garden or home landscape or restoration site, plants like Solidago altissima could be exactly what you want. So it is nuanced, but I would say the plants that we would consider to be really aggressive or maybe fall in that category, it was actually a pretty small minority of plants that we thought were maybe not so friendly to the small home garden. The vast majority of goldenrods in the trial really were, I would say, if you will, well-behaved, clump-forming, not really overly tall, much more manageable for kind of your average home landscape.
Yeah, the canadensis can be obviously a little tall, a bit floppy,
Sure.
and of course the reseeding that we already referred to. So a more compact habit, a more well-behaved plant would be great for the home garden. So we'll talk about some of those selections in a minute. But let's go over the whole trial.
Sure.
And so you evaluated 70 types, which included 50 distinct species and cultivars.
That's right. Yeah, this was a very species-heavy trial. And most of the cultivars that we evaluated are selections of wild-type plants, so not a lot of breeding or continuous selection that was in this trial. A very sharp contrast to other trials like Heuchera or Echinacea, where a lot of those plants that were evaluated are hybrids or plants that were continually selected in cultivation. Most of the goldenrods are they still have those wild genes in them, or not very far removed from a wild-type plant. So we're looking at all the diversity that a lot of our North American or Eastern North American species have. And even though we evaluated 50 species, that is not the entirety of all goldenrods that are found in the Eastern Temperate Forest region, but it's a really great place to start. And one of the coolest things about this trial was just seeing the diversity of these plants, from their size, habit, foliage forms, texture, bloom times. It's just an incredibly diverse group. And I think before I started this trial, I always talk about, maybe like those big 5 or big 6 goldenrods that I think a lot of us know in gardens. But this trial really allowed us to take that deeper dive and look at some of these plants that maybe aren't as well known or maybe not as frequently encountered in cultivation.
You evaluated some rarer things, some more obscure selections that might not be available to the gardening public. And in the past, like with your sedges trial, when you came out with the report, that kind of caught the industry unawares, we'll say, and they were like, ooh, we need to stock up on this plant. It's going to take several years. So I know this time some of the top rated plants, you gave a heads up to the horticultural industry so they know what's coming.
Yeah, and this trial actually ended a few years ago. We actually finished this in about 2023 and made a decision to delay the report a couple of years to try to get ahead of that a little bit and give the nursery industry around us a little bit more of a head start. And we started communicating more proactively with them on top performing plants that already were commercially available so they could stock up by their own means, purchase those plants, start propagating them in possible anticipation of some demand that might be generated from the report. But we also proactively started to distribute seeds and divisions of some of these top performing species that weren't widely available or were not really present in cultivation before. And we've spent a couple of years trying to distribute seeds and hopefully anticipate some demand and make these plants available so that by the time the report comes out, so now, hopefully some of these plants will be available. The goal of this is to be able to promote plants that you can incorporate in your home garden. We want to get more native plants in the landscape. And by being more proactive in our communications and sharing of information with the nurseries around us, we're hoping to make a difference and a positive impact in terms of what people are able to get for their home gardens.
And so one of the theories behind the report is that there's a goldenrod for every garden and landscape. So
Yes.
We'll go through some of those species and define which does best in maybe which situations. But let's talk about goldenrods in general. So why we want to have them in our garden. And of course, They have highly ornamental beauty. They're a gorgeous yellow flower, mainly late season blooming. A lot of people use them as a cut flower in arrangements as well as having them in their landscape. But I think what a lot of people are growing them for is because they support our pollinators and our birds. And you define them in the report as a keystone species. So we should talk about that term a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And goldenrods really are perennials that are keystone species. And that really just means that these are plants that can support an incredibly diverse group of wildlife, even in cultivation. And goldenrods are just really uniquely poised to support insects, to support birds, to support caterpillars that feed on the foliage. I believe the number of specialist bees is estimated to, or at least the goldenrods can support an estimated 30 to 40 specialist bees in the eastern temperate forest region alone. It can also be a host plant for more than 100 species of butterflies and moths. We see bird activity, we see insect predators on these goldenrods. They really are kind of these self-contained hubs for wildlife activity in a cultivated space. If you're looking to bring in wildlife in your home garden, if you're looking to elevate ecological value in your home landscape, goldenrods are a really, really great place to start.
Some of my favorite birds to see on them, of course, are the yellow ones, the finches.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I feel like, is that where they get their color from in the feathers?
I believe that is actually true. I've heard that that is one of the reasons that you see goldfinches on yellow flowers. And the other birds that we see quite a lot is in the goldenrod trial were warblers. We saw lots of warblers present in the goldenrod trial. It's actually, I miss them not having the goldenrods in the trial as much. Although we will have the top performers still in the trial garden that you can see this spring when we reopen. But warblers were always in there during their fall migration. We saw several species. Really, what we think they were doing was foraging for insects that the goldenrods were attracting. And of course, in the winter, we saw juncos, white-throated sparrows eating the seeds. Again, just a huge amount of value beyond what it can just provide for insects in a garden setting.
And those monarch butterflies that are visiting it, because people think it's only the milkweed, because there's been such a great campaign of public education about planting milkweeds for monarchs. They don't understand that there are other plants that monarchs need as well.
Yeah, absolutely. These late season nectar sources are gas stations, if you will, for migrating monarchs. They need those nectar sources just as much as those caterpillars need the leaves of various milkweed species. Plants like goldenrod, plants like ironweeds can be a really great place for these monarchs to get that little nutrition that they need on their migration down to Mexico. And by strategically including some of these late season blooming perennials, you can really do a lot to support monarchs on that migration.
I love the fact that you can have that late season color, but I also like the fact that goldenrods, if you have a few different kinds, you can go kind of from midsummer to almost, I would say, October, almost into November in the mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the things that was really impressive to us was just how long that bloom season was. Not for individual plants, but again, like you said, if you strategically chose goldenrod species, we had one that was a bit of an outlier that started blooming in May, which is an alpine species called Solidago cutleri. But we had a few other species that really kind of started in June and July. Early goldenrod is one of those, Solidago Jentz. It's a locally native species, beautiful plant, like drier, leaner soils. But if you included a plant like Solidago Jentz and then included other plants like Solidago gigantea that blooms in kind of that July-August window, and then included plant material like Solidago altissima and a lot of the other goldenrods start blooming in September and October, you can cover months of the year with goldenrod blooms. And those blooms are not just going to look great in your garden, be really, really effective companion plants, but it's also going to be providing that wildlife value for an extended period. And yeah, we had one goldenrod species, Solidago leavenworthii, that consistently bloomed into November. And there were insects visiting those flowers up until the bitter end, up until that last really hard frost. And a lot of those were bumblebees a lot of those were probably queen bumblebees getting their last floral resources before their winter hibernation. So it's really important to have these late season perennials. But again, goldenrods are not just those fall and those really late fall bloomers. There's lots of variation in bloom times depending on the species and selection.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I think with goldenrods too, and sprinkling them throughout the growing season, you're going to have that yellow spotlight in your garden, which is such a great color to combine with almost any other color in your garden.
Absolutely. Yep. And some of them look really good. We talked about ironweeds a little bit before. Some of these ironweeds and goldenrods make incredible companions, and that purple and yellow is one of my favorite combinations in my home garden, at least.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say that with the yellows, it creates a little bit of spotlight, but it contrasts well with a lot of things. But it's maybe a range of yellows, I think, in the goldenrods. Some are more on the kind of lemony yellow, pale side, and some might be almost to the orangey side, right?
Yeah, you do kind of get that spectrum where some of them are a little bit lighter yellow, some of them are more acid yellow. But there are a couple of goldenrods out there, not the majority, but there are a couple that have white flowers as well, which are really interesting. A couple of those species, Solidago bicolor and Solidago tarmacoides, they prefer drier soils, but they have really unusual flowers. Not really what you'd expect out of goldenrods, but it just again shows you what the diversity of goldenrods really is out there. There's so much to see, and really our goldenrod trial is a good example of the diversity, but there's lots more out there as well.
So you did about 70 types. How many exist total?
I think there's about 100 species in North America. In Eastern North America, I'm not sure what the final number is, but I think we had, I would say, a good chunk of that diversity covered. But goldenrods in general are a largely North American genus. There are a couple of goldenrods outside of North America and Asia and Europe. But I think that accounts for maybe only 10 species in other places in the world. That doesn't include some of our native species that do have more aggressive and invasive tendencies in other parts of the world. But I would say the vast majority or the biggest share of goldenrod diversity exists in North America.
And so let's talk about the trial garden conditions that you had the goldenrods growing in. So full sun. I know
Yes.
I was there to visit it over the last few summers and saw they were out there fully in the open, right along a pathway. So they weren't getting any supplemental watering, correct?
That's correct. Yes. So no additional care from us beyond that first year of establishment, which would have been 2021. And even during that year, we hardly watered them at all. They were really just kind of on their own for 3 growing seasons. And the plants that were able to perform well are those that ended up being top performers. And they're performing at a very high level with, again, very, very limited inputs from us. Now, that being said, we are throwing all of these goldenrods, all of these diverse plants that are coming from different habitats, different parts of the country, all into one setting. And some of those plants are going to be adaptable to that kind of average garden setting, which is kind of how we describe the soils of the trial garden. Again, that full sun exposure, but some of them might not be. And that doesn't mean that those species especially are bad plants. There's certainly a place for them, especially for some. If you have drier soils, they're going to perform better for you, or if you have wetter soils, they're going to perform better for you, or at least better than they performed in the trial garden. But it's always interesting to see which of those plants are surprisingly adaptable to that average garden soil. And in particular, because we grew a lot of these plants we grew them all in full sun, some of these plants that really need shade, like Solidago cassia or blue stem goldenrod, or Solidago flexicalis, the zigzag goldenrod, these are really great woodland plants or plants for the woodland garden, and they did not perform well in the trial garden. But we know just a few feet away in our naturalistic gardens at Mount Cuba Center, these are incredible garden performers. They're staples in our landscape. So again, right plant, right place. But if you are growing in similar conditions to the trial garden, those results are going to apply to you in a big way.
So you're evaluating them on the basis of plant vigor, disease resistance, how many flowers they produce, the form, the habit that would be in a typical garden. But then you also have this team, I think it's called the Pollinator Watch Team,
Yes.
counting the insects that visit these plants.
Yes, and it's a huge job. And really, we're so grateful to have this team of volunteers. They're all called the Pollinator Watch Team. This is about 15 people that are out there observing the insect activity in the trial garden on a near daily basis, sometimes twice daily. We do have a morning shift and an afternoon shift. And they're out there looking at this insect activity, trying to quantify it for us so we can have a basic understanding of which of these plants are attracting more insects than others in a cultivated space in common garden conditions. And it really does kind of show people which of these plants they can expect to be bringing in the most insect activity to their home garden. It can help people make more informed decisions if their goals really are just to bring in the wildlife, bring in those insects, bring in those caterpillars, bring in those birds, if that's their goal, we can provide a really good starting place for those people to choose those plants that are kind of performing head and shoulders above the rest. Now, most goldenrods do attract a lot of insect activity, but some of them are just a little bit better than others.
And where you're located in northern Delaware, outside of Wilmington, that's going to relate a lot to many of us who garden in the mid-Atlantic.
Absolutely.
And one thing I always thought about when I visit the trials there is that usually I'm there on a day when there's a lot of other horticulturists there. You know, there could be 50 or 100 people surrounding these plants.
Sure.
And I think about, won't this kind of impact also the data on how many insects are visiting? Because we're kind of creating a human interference here. But then I think that's the same thing we're doing in our home gardens too.
Yeah, and we do try to give the insect space a little bit. I mean, the observers, the volunteers, the pollinator watch team, we do things like trying not to cast a shadow and being far enough from the plant that we feel like we can still accurately observe the insects visiting, but not close enough that we feel like we're influencing the plant too much. But there is always that thought. But again, we really are evaluating a plant that we feel is very similar to a home garden. I'm sure if these plants were in a system, in a combination or a mixed planting in a naturalistic garden or in a restoration site, people might be seeing different things. But I think what we see in the trial garden can be maybe not directly applied, but is very relevant to what the home gardener should be seeing in the mid-Atlantic region and in regions beyond it, the Midwest, maybe southern New England, maybe parts of the southeastern United States. You should be seeing very similar results that we are seeing in the trials.
For sure. So we're talking about having it in a mixed planting. Most of the time, you're not going to just have goldenrod by itself unless it's, say, a restoration area or a meadow in a large parkland or, you know, a natural area. So for the home gardener, let's talk about how goldenrod does best. Maybe we'll talk about the Solidago rugosa fireworks. That was one of the top rated plants. If I was to bring that home in a pot from my local garden center or nursery, what's my next step, Sam?
Yeah, so that plant is an incredibly forgiving and beautiful plant. It requires very little from us. And these are some of my favorite plants. And again, a lot of times these are the plants that end up getting promoted in our trials because, again, we're not doing much to these plants at all. These are, I would say, low input and very high output plants. And fireworks, wrinkle leaf goldenrod really exemplifies all those qualities. This is a plant I wouldn't say you plant and forget it, but it is a plant that you can plant maybe in early spring or in fall, water it once and twice, and then you can forget it until it starts blooming in late summer and early fall. Fireworks is a truly exceptional selection of the species. I think it was made in 1970 in a coastal habitat in North Carolina by some staff from North Carolina Botanic Garden. It was later introduced by Niche Garden, I think in 1990, and it has been a staple in the horticultural world ever since. It has a really nice habit, these beautiful mounded growth habits, just incredible floral displays as well, and it attracts a ton of insects. It can spread a little bit, but if you grow it in drier soils, it's going to be a little more restrained. The more moisture you give it, the quicker it is going to spread. It is not an invasive or an aggressive plant by any means. And if you plant it with other more large and robust companions, they will kind of keep that plant in check. But we use it extensively in our formal gardens. It is a stunning punctuation to our perennial beds. It's just a really, really phenomenal plant that has actually it was a top performer in Richard Hawkey's trials at Chicago Botanic Gardens and their goldenrod trials. It was recently given the gold medal from the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society for really great garden plants just this past year, and it has gotten our top performer endorsement as well. So this is a plant that's been out there for a long time, and it is still really worthy of consideration for the average home garden.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
Get low-maintenance alternatives to lawns with Ground Cover Revolution by Kathy Jentz. Reducing the lawn is among the biggest trends in homeownership, with an endless stream of homeowners looking for an eco-friendly alternative to a traditional turfgrass lawn. In the last few years alone, over 23 million Americans converted part of the lawn to a natural landscape, and now they're looking to do even more. The biggest challenge to adopting this new ideal of the perfect lawn? Knowing how and when to replace your turf and which plants are the best ones for the job. Ground Cover Revolution is here with all the answers you need, and some you didn't even know you needed. Included are 40 in-depth profiles of plants that are perfect choices for replacing a grass lawn. There are options for sun, for shade, for dry and wet sites, and for various climates around the globe. There are choices that bloom, options that are evergreen, and selections that are deer-resistant. Kathy Jentz has also included an incredibly useful chart that gives you all the specifics on each of the 40 choices for quick reference and to make your ground cover selection process even easier. Whether you want to replace the entire lawn or just reduce the amount of land dedicated to turf, Ground Cover Revolution will help you usher in a new and improved idea of what a beautiful lawn should be. Ground Cover Revolution is available now wherever you buy books, including Amazon.com and Bookshop.org.
So you mentioned companion plants for your Solidago, and so I'm imagining it might be other natives like Echinacea, Rudbeckia. What others do you recommend planting it with?
Yeah, so our horticulture team has done a fabulous job in providing this plant with really effective companions. We use it with plants like Amsonia hubrichtii or the threadleaf blue star. We actually use it with Phlox paniculata jenna, and we actually do a cutback or a chop on our jenna plants, and it eventually really what it does is it makes for a later bloom period, which coincides really well with fireworks. We also use some New England asters, like Almapachki is a really popular plant that we have in our formal gardens that mixes beautifully with fireworks. There's actually a really nice photo of that planting in our research report, which you can see in our top performer section there.
Cool. So you talked about cutting back the Phlox jenna. What about doing that Chelsea chop or mid-season cutback on the goldenrods?
Yeah, a lot of the goldenrods are really adaptable to that cutback, and it can be a really great way to make them a little bit smaller and a little bit more manageable in kind of an average home garden where you may not want a plant that's out of a certain height. The cutback really does help reduce the overall size of the plant and promote better branching structures. We found that with a lot of the goldenrods, some of the plants that responded best to that cutback were the plants that had thinner stems and thinner leaves overall, although a lot of them did respond positively overall to the cutback. There were goldenrods that we would not recommend the cutback for at all, and that was this oligoneuron group of goldenrods. Now, the oligoneuron group, or the Tarmacoidea group, is a group of goldenrods that have at certain times been classified in their own genus. They're also known as the flat-top goldenrods. This includes Solidago rigida, Solidago ohiensis. A couple of these plants in this group were actually top performers from our trial. But what we found is when we cut those plants back in, let's say, late May or early June, their vertical growth essentially stopped for the year.
Oh.
They didn't produce any more flowers, any more vertical growth at all. They might have increased the size of their rosette and put on more foliage, but no flowers were produced by those plants. And we do have those plants highlighted in the report, but those oligoneuron group or the Tarmacoidea group of goldenrods do not benefit from a Chelsea chop.
That is some great information to know, because you wouldn't want to lose all your flowers for the season by accidentally cutting those back.
Yeah, we were really surprised. I mean, it just essentially halted all vertical growth, which we've not seen in any other group of plants. When we've done the Chelsea chop, we've done that experiment with a lot of other trials, including ironweeds and echinacea. And so far, that group of goldenrods is the only one that has responded in such a negative way.
Interesting. And so what if I was a small space gardener, maybe only able to grow in containers? What goldenrods would you recommend for that growing situation?
There's a couple, and there, like we said, thanks to the diversity of goldenrods out there, there really is a goldenrod for, every kind of soil type, every light exposure, and even any kind of scale that you might have in your home garden, from expansive meadows to maybe just your back patio. There are plants for you in this trial. And even if you're growing in just a small container, plants like Solidago's fasciolata or autumn goldenrod is a really, really great option. It's a smaller plant, it's more of a ground cover, and it produces beautiful inflorescences that are perfectly in scale for smaller home gardens. And there's actually a selection out there. The wild type plant Solidago's fasciolata was a top performer in the trial. There is a selection that Mount Cuba Center introduced in the late 80s, called Golden Fleece or Golden Fleece Autumn Goldenrod. Didn't end up being a top performer just because it was a little bit smaller and didn't have that competitive edge that the wild type plant had. But we love using Golden Fleece in our formal gardens in containers at the edges of borders. It's a really small and manageable goldenrod that performs reliably as long as it's not in too competitive an environment. I actually have trouble growing that plant at home because my garden is really wild and kind of rangy and very competitive, but the more wild type Solidago sphaculata is just kind of able to hold its own a little bit better. But in a pot, Golden Fleece would be a really, really good option.
Yeah, I love that recommendation of Golden Fleece, and that is such a nice selection. And so in the trial, you mainly did species, and from the results, the top performers, 11 out of 12 were straight species rather than cultivars. And those we might recommend more for, say, naturalized areas, or there's parklands we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's right. Or if people are just looking for a more naturalistic look, a lot of these plants are a really good option. And some of those wild type plants are just maybe better fits aesthetically for a smaller home garden, although they do have application in naturalistic and restoration settings as well.
And so let's talk about another of the top rated ones, and that was the Pine Barrens Goldenrod.
Yeah, so Solidago fistuloso, this was a really, I think, a very important result for us, or a very interesting result for us at the very least. So Solidago fistuloso, or pine barren goldenrod, this is a species that is native to the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast, and it is relatively common in kind of wetter areas and kind of these back dune wetlands. But it is a species that, for whatever reason, has been overlooked by the horticultural and restoration communities and is almost unavailable. If you were to go look for it a couple of years ago, it'd be very, very difficult to find Solidago fistulosa, if not impossible. But thanks to our former state botanist, Bill McAvoy, he was able to collect seeds from a population in southern Delaware. Our greenhouse team was able to grow on those plants, and we included that species in our trial garden. We didn't know much about it, but we definitely had the endorsement of Bill, who loved that species in its wild habitat. And we were very pleasantly surprised by its performance. It performed neck and neck with fireworks, which again, that's a plant that's been established in the horticultural world for decades. And for a horticultural newcomer, a plant that hasn't been grown widely, virtually unknown in the world of horticulture, for that to be performing neck and neck with a plant that's so well established was a really cool surprise. And it just goes to show you that there's so much out there. What's currently available in the commercial world is not exhaustive in terms of the diversity and potential value of some of these wild plants that may be even just in our backyards. But we love fistulosa for several reasons. It produced beautiful upright stems, has these incredible fuzzy leaves and vertical growths, beautiful flowers, attracted some of the highest numbers of insects in the entire trial, beautiful seed heads, and it even gets fall color. It is a little bit rhizomatous, similar in nature to fireworks, but it can be restrained a little bit either by hand removing some of those stems that are moving to places that you don't want them, growing them in drier soils, or just planting this species in a more competitive garden environment. It's not a goldenrod that's going to overwhelm its neighbors. It will settle in and mix beautifully with other companions.
Can you describe that autumn color?
Yeah, we were getting shades of purple and kind of garnet red, just really deep, almost cranberry tones. It was a little bit of a surprise for us. It was not something that I had thought about for goldenrods really contributing much beyond their fall blooms, but several species of goldenrods did really develop good fall color, and Solidago fistulosa was one of them that consistently displayed some interesting foliar shades, I would say. Sometimes yellow, but more often that kind of red to purple range.
Yeah, I've noticed that especially when we have a long, dry autumn, that the goldenrod foliage will have a nice burgundy cast to it. So that's great to hear for that species in particular. And when we're talking about Pine Barrens goldenrod, the common name for it, I assume that's where it was located in the natural population and the conditions it wants to grow in. And could you describe the Pine Barrens for those listeners who might not be familiar with what a pine barren is?
Yeah, so pine barrens are kind of these sandy coastal habitats, overwhelmingly flat areas. They can be boggy, somewhat dry in certain areas, and this really is a coastal habitat. And Solidago fistulosa is a coastal species that can be found in the pine barrens. It can be found typically in wetter habitats in the pine barrens, in areas where it has constant moisture. But it has proven to be a very adaptable plant beyond sandy soils, beyond that kind of level of moisture it grows in the wild. It's very adaptable to our garden conditions, which is more kind of a clay loam, much richer soil. And despite those differences, Solidago fistulosa ended up being very adaptable, and we expect it to be grown a lot drier as well.
And that makes me think that it might also be salt tolerant.
Yes, it's another species that I think is a great candidate for coastal gardens, for restoration sites, especially in back dune areas, or even parking lots, areas that we would frequently salt in a winter like we're having. It could be a really good candidate. A lot of these coastal species are places I think we should be looking at for parking lot plantings in particular.
Yeah, I think that is top of mind right now, not just for those who live in coastal areas, but
right.
getting those, if you live on a main road like I do, that heavy salt spray from the trucks is not doing favors to the rest of our garden, but some salt-resistant plantings on the roadside or hill strip area is a smart thing. And how about resistance to deer or rabbits?
Yeah, so we were actually able to share a lot of our goldenrods with Temple University at Ambler Arboretum and at the beginning of the trial, and they were able to collect deer resistance data for us in an area where they have a lot of deer pressure. And they basically observed deer browse for 2 years and found that the vast majority of goldenrods are very resistant to deer browse. Now, I'm not going to say deer proof, but some of these plants were not browsed at all. Only a handful of them were browsed to an unsustainable level. And Solidago fistulosa was one that was, I think, demonstrated a pretty respectable resistance to deer browse, along with a few other species that were also top performers.
Yeah, I'm always surprised that goldenrods are fairly deer resistant, because you would think they would be deer candy. They don't really have a high scent to them. They have a light sweet scent.
Right. Yep.
And the foliage, might have a little bit of that fuzziness or hairiness that they don't like, but not really.
Yeah, and there are, of course, exceptions. Like fistulosa does have those hairs. There's one goldenrod that I know wasn't browsed at all, which was Solidago odora, which does have a very strong licorice or anise scent. But a lot of them, you're right, they don't have overly hairy stems or foliage. They don't have a really strong scent, other than that kind of goldenrod smell that you get from when you bruise the foliage. But yeah, despite all that, they seem to be a fairly resistant group.
Good news for the native gardener, for sure.
That's right, absolutely.
And so goldenrod has had the perception of being weedy. Do you recommend deadheading it at the end of the season, or do you think that deprives the birds from those seeds? How do you walk that line, Sam, in the garden?
Yeah, I think there are certain species that are a little bit more known for self-sowing than others. We saw some of the species that are particularly found in more disturbed areas. They're some of the early colonizers, or are in areas where things can happen quickly, especially in coastal areas. Like Solidago sempervirens is an area that grows directly in sand dunes. And sand dunes can go through quite a lot of change very rapidly, and this is a species that has to be able to adapt to that change and reestablish populations quickly. And Solidago sempervirens, the seaside goldenrod, was one that we saw self-sowing quite a lot. Another one was Solidago erinicola, which grows in these kind of river scours in the wild. Again, kind of this early colonist species that needs to be able to self-sow and reestablish populations rapidly. I would say the vast majority of goldenrods, though, we didn't see that much seedling recruitment, not nearly as much as we saw from the Vernonia trial. And for us, I would prefer to leave the goldenrod seeds up as long as we possibly can, just because it does do such a great job at feeding those winter birds.
Mm-hmm.
If you can leave it up, that's great. If you really can't have it self-sowing, I would maybe kind of find a happy medium where you maybe remove half of the stems, but try to leave some of those seeds up as best you can. And, the seed heads are also ornamentally attractive during the off season as well.
For sure. And I know a lot of people are recommending, of course, leaving those stems up for the overwintering solitary bees. Sure. Are you finding them in goldenrod stems as well?
Yes, some of them, especially some of the more robust goldenrod stems. And it's really important that those stems can persist for more than a year. Some of those goldenrods really just don't produce strong, robust stems, and they kind of melt away after a single year. But plants like Solidago altissima, Solidago gigantea, some of these plants with these really larger diameter stems that do persist for multiple years, those are plants that we really try to cut back or leave the garden stubble, if you will, to coin or to use Rebecca McMackin's term there. We'd like to leave maybe like 8 to 24 inches of stem when you can, just to allow that entry and overwintering place for those solitary bees that are living in those stems or potentially living in those stems.
I like that stubble term. I think that makes it almost fashionable.
Yes. Full credit to Rebecca, of course.
And so we talked about a lot of the goldenrods that do well in full sun, and your trial was mainly in full sun, and you said some do better back in your collection more shaded. So for those shade native gardens, what are some species or cultivars that you recommend for those situations?
Yeah, a couple we really love here is blue stem goldenrod, and this is one that's locally native to us. We see on kind of roadsides and road cuts and kind of shadier areas around us in the Mid-Atlantic region. But it's a really popular garden plant. It is an incredible plant for woodland gardens. It gives you that pop of color and that brightness in the fall, and also amplifies the wildlife value of a woodland garden. It provides a lot of pollinator value in the shade. Solidago flexicalis, very similar idea, is a little bit better at creating a ground cover, where Solidago acacia or blue stem goldenrod is a little more wispy and kind of arching. Both of these plants, locally native, beautiful goldenrods, again, didn't perform well in the trial, but great in a shade garden. And there were a couple slightly more obscure goldenrods. There's one that can be found in our natural lands called Solidago patula, or broadleaf goldenrod, I believe is the common name. It has these big, beautiful, almost spoon-shaped leaves and these large, they look like heads of lettuce almost in the early spring. And they grow in wetter habitats in the shade, where Solidago acacia and flexicalis prefer kind of dry to average soils. Solidago patula is a really great candidate for kind of wet woodlands and seepy areas in shaded gardens. And it provides a really interesting vertical accent as well. As those flowering stems develop, it's just really strongly vertical and creates these beautiful open sprays of inflorescences in late summer and fall. A little bit more of an obscure plant, but you can find it from some specialty native growers as well.
And that does bring us to sourcing some of those goldenrods, which we touched on a little bit before. Do you recommend your local nursery garden center, maybe some specialty native nurseries?
Yeah, any and all. I think there is a growing availability of goldenrods and an understanding that there is demand for goldenrods out there, even from, I wouldn't say box stores yet, but some from even garden centers and some of the larger growers out there. They're gaining some traction. I think there's an understanding that people are interested in not just beautifying their landscape, but also providing value to their landscape, and goldenrods are very effective at doing both. Some of the smaller, more specialty growers out there, you might find some of the more unusual species, including some of the ones that were included in our evaluations, and kind of keep an eye on some of these names of some of these top performers that maybe weren't commercially available before, but we're hoping that a lot of these will be commercially available this spring and through this next growing season.
And if we wanted to collect seed and propagate our own, do you have any special advice for that?
Yeah, they're actually very easy to grow from seed. One of the considerations that you kind of have to take into account for goldenrods is the seed is very tiny, and it does not want to be covered up. It needs light to germinate, and it also needs a cool, moist treatment to overcome that dormancy. You can do that in a couple of ways. You can do it by direct sowing those seeds in your garden in the fall, kind of letting that natural temperature cycles and moisture cycles of the winter, late fall, and early spring kind of take its course and overcome that dormancy, after which those seeds will readily germinate in the spring. Or you can do it artificially in your refrigerator. You have a little bit more control that way, but I think either way is perfectly viable. What I do is I take a little bit of vermiculite in a plastic baggie, add my seed, add just a tiny bit of moisture, put it in the refrigerator for a couple of months, pull it out, and for goldenrods, again, directly sow those seeds at the top of the soil surface, keep it humid, don't let those seeds dry out, and you should get germination really quickly. And I would expect blooms on those plants in the second growing season.
Yeah, I was going to ask how long from seed to bloom, but with a perennial, it's not going to be that first year usually.
Generally not, although some of these faster growing species, you could get them in that first year.
Besides the reseeding issue that some gardeners have, a lot will not grow goldenrod because they associate it with hay fever or allergies. So let's dispel that myth.
Yeah. So, with all the diversity of goldenrods, with them growing in all kinds of habitats, there's a lot of diversity out there in goldenrods. But one thing that they all have in common is they don't cause allergies. They all rely on insects to move their pollen. Their pollen is rather heavy and sticky. They rely on insects to, transport that pollen from one flower to another or from one individual plant to another. What's actually causing hay fever during that time of year when we're seeing those goldenrods, and that's a very visually obvious plant, if you will. Most people, they see goldenrods and they were thinking, well, that's what's blooming, that's what's causing my allergies. But it's actually a plant that's blooming at the same time that has a much more subtle flower, and most of the time that is ragweed. Ragweed produces these tiny little green flowers that are interesting if you look at them up close, but this is producing a tremendous amount and volume of windborne pollen, and that's really what's contributing to that kind of fall hay fever.
Yeah, so stop blaming the goldenrod.
That's right. If nothing else is accomplished by this trial, hopefully we'll get that message across.
And I was thinking about some of the goldenrods you highlight in the report that we haven't talked about yet. And is there a favorite we haven't covered?
Gosh, I really like them all. It's hard to pick a favorite, but I think there's a couple that I really, really like. One of them is Solidago ohiensis, and I was lucky enough to see that plant in the wild in a very wet, boggy habitat in Ohio, which obviously is where this species is found, as well as in other parts of the Midwestern United States. But it's such an elegant perennial. It grows beautifully in kind of wet to average soils. It's a very manageable size. It maybe gets to 2 or 3 feet tall, big, showy inflorescences. They're part of that Tarmacoidea group, that really flat-top goldenrod group of goldenrod species. It's just such a beautiful plant. I think is a very good candidate for a lot of home gardeners who are looking for a smaller plant that might be clump forming, well behaved, if you will. And it grows alongside some other really cool goldenrods out there, some of which were not top performers, but Solidago ridellii, just an incredible foliage texture. Again, grows alongside Solidago ohiensis in the wild. Solidago uliginosa, or bog goldenrod, is another species that grows with them, has these very vertical wand-like inflorescences. There's that community in some of these more Midwestern wetlands. I think there's some really incredible goldenrod diversity and a lot of very garden-friendly plants that come from those habitats.
It sounds like they might do well, say, in a rain garden situation, or like a swale or a ditch garden, by the roadside.
Yeah, I have Solidago ohiensis and ridellii together in a rain garden I built 2 years ago at home, and they're beautiful in that setting. Really, visually a stunning plant. Both of those species are stunning plants, but also the amount of insect activity they bring into that small space is really incredible.
I'll have to try those out. And so, Sam, how can our listeners contact you to find out more? How can they access this report?
Yeah, so this goldenrod report, just like any of our other reports so far, are all available for free on our website at mtcubicenter.org/trial garden. All of that information, including all the plants that maybe didn't perform so well in the trials, that's all on our website. And we also have sortable Excel files that you can go through and basically kind of curate lists of goldenrod for yourself, depending on growing conditions, the aesthetic qualities you want out of those plants. That's a great tool for basically generating lists of goldenrods that will work well for your specific goals. And if I may, we are also teaching a goldenrod class on February 18th in the evening. I'll be giving a really in-depth dive on the goldenrod trial, talking about some things that we weren't able to cover in the report, and I'd love to see you there. And in addition, if anybody has any questions about the goldenrod trial, please feel free to reach out at info@mtcubicenter.org, mtcubicenter.org. We'd be happy to get in touch with you if you have any questions about the goldenrod trial or anything else.
Great. And I will include a link to the report in our show notes. And I'm sure some listeners will want to come to Mount Cuba in person and visit and see that trial. So let's talk about accessing Mount Cuba as a visitor.
Yeah, so while we do offer programs year-round and a lot of virtual talks in the off-season as well as on-site kind of events, our regular season of visitation is April 1st through about Thanksgiving every year. While we won't have the entire goldenrod trial on display on April 1st in the trial garden, we will have all of the top performers represented back in the trial garden in our top performer bed. So you can take that research report or look at it online, and you can see those plants in front of you, interact with them, if you come kind of July, August, September, October, you'll be able to see those plants in full bloom as well, and to make decisions in person about which of those plants might be the best fit for your home landscape.
Perfect. I can't wait to get up there this summer and visit again and see the gardens in process, and maybe to hang out for a little bit with you, Sam.
Absolutely. You're welcome anytime.
Thank you so much for joining us again on the GardenDC podcast.
Thank you for having me.
GardenDC will be back after this short break.
In the book The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spate, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space. No matter what you grow, the 101 amazing growing ideas found in the urban garden will turn your tiny urban yard into a treasure trove of green you'll be proud to share with family and friends. Buy your copy today at your local retail bookseller or order it online now at Amazon.com or bookshop.org.
Skunk cabbage plant profile. Eastern skunk cabbage, Symplocarpus fetidus, is a herbaceous perennial plant. It's also known as swamp cabbage, clumpfoot cabbage, meadow cabbage, fetid pothos, West Virginia hosta, or polecat weed. It has huge leaves that, when bruised, smell like, well, skunk. Or some people say overcooked cabbage, mustard, or garlic. The purplish flower, which is called a spathe, looks a lot like its smaller cousin, the jack-in-the-pulpit Erycema trifolium. It attracts flies, gnats, and beetles for pollination. It's native to the eastern half of the United States and is hardy to USDA zones 4 to 7. There is also a western skunk cabbage and an Asian cousin. The plant emerges from the ground in late winter into early spring. Amazingly, it generates enough heat to melt the snow around it as it emerges. Eastern skunk cabbage is typically found in very wet soil, such as by stream valleys, bogs, and marshes. And that's the best place to plant it in your garden. Note that it does go dormant around early summer if it's planted in drier soils, but in wetter conditions it persists into autumn. It prefers to grow in part to full shade. It can reach 3 feet tall and 4 feet wide during years of heavy rainfall. Once established, they are very difficult to transplant because the root system can be larger than the plant above ground. Seed is the best way to propagate skunk cabbage, but you must sow the seeds immediately when ripe, as they are very ephemeral. The foliage contains heavy amounts of oxalic acid, so it is deer and pest resistant. According to the National Wildlife Federation, bears will eat the berry-like fruit. They also eat the roots after emerging from hibernation because the roots can act as a laxative. Skunk cabbage, you can grow that. What's new in the garden this week? Well, I'm enjoying the blooms on my witch hazel branches that I'm forcing indoors. In garden tips that we shared on our social media this week, we talked about seed starting, including to use a kitchen sieve to sprinkle soilless seed starting mix evenly over the top of the seeds that call for a thin layer of soil to germinate them. In local gardening events that you might want to attend, the Smithsonian Gardens and U.S. Botanic Garden are presenting the 30th annual orchid exhibition this year in collaboration with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. You can explore the many ways orchids connect individuals, communities, and nature. The show is themed More Than a Flower, the Connective Power of Orchids. It runs from January 30th to April 26th at the museum, and you can go to the Smithsonian website to claim your free timed entry passes. And then speaking of the U.S. Botanic Garden, they are holding their annual open house at their production facility on March 7th. Rarely does the public get in to see the garden's growing facility, 85,000 square feet under glass, divided into 34 greenhouse bays and 17 environmental zones. You can apply for tickets. They are free. Go to the U.S. Botanic Gardens website. There is a parking fee, and friends of the U.S. Botanic Garden do get a discount. And again, that's Saturday, March 7th from 10 a.m. to 2:30 at their production facility outside of Washington, D.C. And then at the U.S. National Arboretum, they are hosting their annual LAR Native Plant Symposium on Saturday, March 28th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the U.S. National Arboretum's grounds in Washington, D.C. This all-day event features a slate of expert speakers who will touch on a variety of topics, exploring themes both new to the symposium and familiar, mainly about growing native plants for our region. There will also be a native plant sale that takes place concurrently outside the symposium from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. To register for the symposium, you can go to eventbrite.com and find out more details at FONA. That's FONA.org. Happy gardening!
This is The Last Word by Christy Page at Food Gardening Network, with the sweetest winter squash from acorn to sunshine by Amanda MacArthur. I don't know about you, but I used to think winter squash meant acorn squash, butternut squash, or pumpkins. Then I had a Delecta squash fresh from a farmer's market, simply roasted with salt, pepper, and a drizzle of olive oil. It was the softest, sweetest winter squash I had ever tasted, slightly caramelized from the oven and rich with warm flavors. Don't get me wrong, I still love acorn and butternut squash and cook them regularly, but there are dozens of varieties of winter squash that run anywhere from super sweet to strictly ornamental. With so many varieties, it would be difficult to cover all of them or say with absolute certainty which is the sweetest winter squash. Instead, I'm going to cover some of the different types of squash and then some varieties within each type. There are 5 of the sweetest winter squashes around, and they are acorn table queen squash. Okay, in truth, acorn squash wouldn't typically be among the sweetest winter squash. It's a bit more on the savory side and even a little nutty. However, acorn squash is perfect for stuffing, so you could potentially make it quite sweet, and you don't even need to peel it if you go that route. It's also easy to find whether you want to plant the seeds or buy them at the market. Waltham butternut squash is an All-American Selections A winner. Considered the gold standard for large butternut squash, the large fruits have thick, straight necks and small seed cavities. The flesh is smooth and sweet, and the flavor only improves after a couple months of storage. Autumn Frost Hybrid Winter Squash is another squash that's in the butternut category. It has a reputation for tasting better than butternut squash while also having excellent storage quality and the look of a small frosty pumpkin. Its flavor improves in storage, which is good, and this variety produces heavy yields. Burgess Buttercup Squash. While the name makes it sound like part of the butternut family, the Burgess Buttercup Squash is the species of Cucurbita maxima, and the butternut squash is in the species Cucurbita moscata. So, Burgess butternut squash sets the standard for golden squash way back in 1952, and it's still going strong. It's an heirloom squash. It has a turbine shape with a deep green skin streaked with silvery stripes and spots. Next is the sunshine squash, also known as sunshine kabocha squash. The small to medium-sized hybrid looks like a miniature version of a typical jack-o'-lantern type pumpkin. It may be small, but the sunshine has earned its place as one of the sweetest winter squashes. Bake it, mash it, make it into a pie. It's creamy, sweet, smooth, and stringless. Whichever variety you choose, there are a few tools that will help your winter squash thrive while they're growing. One of them is the squash cradle. If you want to give your squash the best chance at growing to full ripeness, you'll want to keep them off the ground, away from insects, and excess moisture. The cradle keeps your growing gourds above the ground fray, safe and suspended with plenty of good air circulation. Be sure to watch for pests too, as there are a few common bugs that like to feed on squash vines. leaves, and fruits. You can make your own pest spray with benign materials. Mix 1 tablespoon of baking soda, a half a teaspoon of mild dish detergent, and 2.5 tablespoons of olive oil in a gallon of water to make a solution that will repel all kinds of bugs, as well as a fungicide for blight and mildew on squash plant leaves. Shake it well in your bottle before spraying and repeat every week to be continuously effective. This has been The Last Word by Christy Page at foodgardening.com.
Thank you for listening to GardenDC. This episode was made by real humans. It was produced and hosted by myself, Kathy Jentz. The Let the Sunshine music interludes are by James Mulvaney. If you like this episode, you may also enjoy listening to GardenDC podcast episode 227, Ironweed, episode 182, Amsonia, episode 134, Carex, episode 99, Trilliums. You can become a listener supporter by going to the link in our show notes. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com or WashingtonGardener.blogspot.com. You can find Washington Gardener on Twitter or X, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Pinterest at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook at Washington Gardener Magazine. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast listening app. Please take a moment to share us on social media with hashtag GardenDC and with your gardening friends so other gardeners can find us too.